my name's Taylor and I'm a member of the Clark Public Utilities Stream Team. Stream Team plants trees along streams to help improve the stream quality and create salmon habitat. Now salmon live in the water and trees are on the land. So how is planting trees going to help out salmon? Well, first we're going to talk about water. Now if you look at a map of the world, it looks like there's a lot of water. There's a ton of blue space on the globe, but if you've ever tasted salt water, you can't really use it in your household for drinking water. It's not the same stuff that's going to come out of your sink. What we use for that is called fresh water. This jar here represents all of the water in the entire world. Freshwater, saltwater, ocean water, all of it. But only 3% of the world's water is actually usable fresh water. So if we fill up this jar here, this represents the 3% of the world's water that's usable, drinkable fresh water. But out of that 3%, 2% of that isn't even usable because it's either glacial water stored that's frozen or groundwater that's used in aquifers. So if we take this jar and pour it into this tiny one, this small glass represents all of the usable fresh water in the world. Now, since it's not very much, it makes sense that we'd want to take care of it and think critically about how we're managing that water. So if this water all ends up in the ocean, do you think it's just gone forever and disappears? No, right? So the world actually has a natural process of cycling through water, and that's called the water cycle. Now, you may or may not have already heard about the water cycle, but we're just going to take a minute to review all those steps. Now, what happens if you have a puddle on a hot summer day? The water's going to disappear, right? So what happens when that water's disappearing? That water is actually evaporating. So through the process of evaporation, that water is going to turn from a liquid to a gas up into the air. Now once all that water's up there and you have all of these gas molecules floating around and colliding with each other, what do you think is going to form? Clouds, right? So that happens through the process of condensation. Now you can think about condensation a little bit differently so that it's a little bit easier to picture. If you have a really cold, icy drink on a really hot day, what's going to happen to the outside of that glass? It's going to get a little bit wet, right? Water's going to appear on the outside. Now that's not the water from the inside of the glass magically moving to the outside of the glass, but it's actually condensation happening. So once we have all of those clouds happening in the sky and all of that is collecting in condensation, if it gets really stormy out, what's going to happen? It rains, right? So when all of that water rains down from the clouds, that's called precipitation. And now after that water precipitates, it's all going to gather in spots on the ground through the process of collection. Now I have a couple friends here to help me go through those steps one more time. So the first step is evaporation.
Evaporation.
Condensation.
Condensation.
Precipitation.
Precipitation.
And collection.
Collection.
Now taking a closer look at that last step of the water cycle, collection, we're going to talk about watersheds. Now you may or may not have already learned what a watershed is, but a watershed is basically an area of land where the water flows to a common place. Watersheds can look like some downhill flowing of water, since water flows downhill, that meets at a stream or a river, so you're going to have some downhill slopes with that water source there. Now just to reiterate, a watershed is an area of land where that water is flowing to a common place. To take a better look at how practices you use at home might impact a watershed and the salmon that are part of it, we're going to take a look at this watershed model here. First, looking at this neighborhood we have. Now, a lot of you probably live in a neighborhood. I don't know if you've ever noticed what a storm drain is before, but a storm drain is basically a drainage spot on the side of sidewalks, maybe in neighborhoods or other sidewalks, where water flows and it's actually untreated, so it's going to end up directly in the watershed and directly in those streams. So that means whatever goes down the drain with the water is also ending up there. In this neighborhood, we have a car. So what happens if your car or your family's car has an oil leak? We're going to add some soapy water here to this model to represent an oil leak. Now, do you think that that oil leak is just going to stay on the sidewalk forever? Probably not. Since we get a lot of rain here in the Northwest, it's going to rain and end up down those storage drains. Now the same thing happens if you wash your car. You're going to have all kinds of soap and water that's going to drain off of the sidewalk. Like with oil leaks, that water is going to end up in the streams in the same way. Now, a couple practices that you can directly use to prevent that from happening are fixing oil leaks on your car or washing your car on the grass instead of the sidewalk. That grass is actually going to act as a filtration system for that water and catch a lot of that soap that would otherwise end up directly in the streams. Now, a lot of you might have dogs or other pets. Now, what happens when those dogs go into your backyard? A lot of the time, they're probably gonna poop, right? And if you don't clean up that poop, a lot of bacteria from it will end up into the watershed. So we're gonna add a little bit of poop to this model just to represent that dog poop there. Now, looking over here in this area of the model, we have some trees with some construction equipment, and this is going to represent deforestation. Now, you may or may not have already heard of deforestation, but it's basically where large areas of trees are being cut down at a pretty rapid rate. Now, what do you think happens when we take all of those trees and all of their roots out of that area? Since tree roots hold together a lot of soil in place, it's going to be more likely that landslides or a lot of erosion is going to happen. Now, if erosion is happening next to stream banks, a lot of that mud and dirt is going to end up in the stream. And do you think that salmon like muddy water? Probably not, right? They probably prefer their fresh, clean water. So we're going to add some dirt and mud to the model up here to represent what happens with deforestation. Now down here we have a farm, and there's a number of different things that happen with farms that could end up in streams. So to make sure that plants are growing a lot bigger, it's pretty common to use different fertilizers. So we're going to add some fertilizers here. And if those fertilizers are going untreated into the water, it's bad for water quality and bad for salmon health. We can also take a look at organic and inorganic fertilizers that could also end up in the streams and have similar impacts. So we're going to add some of those here as well. And finally, we're going to take a look over here where we have a factory. And for the sake of this model, we're going to say that it's a clothing factory. Now, there's a pretty big smokestack here that we can see. And if we think about a lot of air pollution that might come out of that smokestack, and then think back to the water cycle step of condensation, a lot of that air pollution can end up back into the water cycle if it's up in the air and up in the clouds. Now, clothing factories especially can have a lot of water pollution, so we are going to add some of that on here. And now, while we can't directly prevent water pollution at factories, we can impact whether or not we are using more or less of their products. So if we're buying a new pair of sneakers every year, for example, when our old ones might still be okay, it's increasing the amount of water pollution that's going to be happening from these factories. So to stop that, you might wait until your clothes are really run down and you need a new pair of shoes, or you can buy clothing secondhand to try to offset some of those effects. Now, since we get a lot of rain here in the Northwest, we're going to make it rain on this water cycle to show how all of these different sources we've identified will impact the quality of streams. So starting with the neighborhood and those car oil leaks and car wash soap and dog poop, we're going to move all across the model here over to the factory and finally back over to the farm. And since, like we said earlier, water runs downhill, you can see how all of these different things have wound up in the stream. Now, do you think salmon like muddy water like this? Do you think salmon like this water quality? Probably not, right? They probably prefer the clean, fresh water that we started with. Now, I know we've talked about a lot of different ways that you can help prevent this quality from happening. But one of the biggest ones that we haven't really addressed yet is by planting trees. Trees, I know we said a little bit earlier, can prevent erosion through their roots. So they're going to keep the stream banks from eroding and keep the water a lot less muddy. Trees also create a lot of shade. And salmon really like that cool water. They way prefer the colder water over the warmer water. So having trees there and creating that form of shade is really, really helpful for them. And finally, trees produce oxygen. And not only is that good for salmon, but it's also good for us, since us and salmon both really need oxygen. Now, if you want to get involved and help plant some trees with Stream Team to improve water quality and help salmon health, you can get involved by finding one of our events at clarkpublicutilities.com.